It starts with a stench, a really bad one. In 1911, two miners, David Pugh and James Hart, make their way into a dry rock shelter nestled in the Humboldt Range of northwestern Nevada. The cave is remote, perched above a desolate stretch of what used to be Lake Lahonatan. The air inside is thick with ammonia. Beneath their boots, meters of compressed bat guano blanket the floor. They're not looking for bones. They're there for fertilizer. Guano, dried and powdered, makes excellent explosives. The miners begin clearing out the layers with shovels and picks, dumping it into sacks. But not long into the job, they hit something unexpected. A bone. Then another. Then a skull. The human remains are old, fragile, brittle, partially mummified. Some are buried in the guano. Others are lying flat on the floor, preserved by the dry desert air. Near one body, they find a reed basket. Next to another, a pair of massive woven sandals, over 15 inches long. And then there's the hair. Red, not brown or black, not oxidized beyond recognition, but clearly reddish, clinging in papery clumps to a skull. That's when the miners stop digging and start talking. They report the find. Within months, the University of Carolina sends archaeologists to investigate. The site is designated Lovelock Cave. But by the time scientists arrive, the damage is done. Over a third of the cave's contents, bones, textiles, artifacts, have already been removed or destroyed in the mining process. Whatever was buried the deepest is gone, lost to shovels and burlap sacks. What remains, however, is strange enough to raise questions that still haven't been answered over a century later. Long before the miners arrived with shovels and sacks, the cave already had a name. To the northern Paiute people, it was Tumbora, a place not of shelter, but of danger. The elders didn't speak of spirits or legends. They remembered something else, a more grounded threat. In northern Paiute oral tradition passed down for generations, there's a story of a long and brutal conflict with a group known as the si-te-cah. They were remembered as a violent and alien people, hostile to their neighbors, unrelenting in their raids. According to the stories, the si-te-cah lived in caves and travelled across the marshes on rafts made of tule reeds. They didn't settle, they didn't farm, they took what they needed, often by force. The Paiute described them as unusually tall, physically strong and hard to kill. But one detail, repeated often enough to stick, was stranger. The si-te-cah was said to have red or light-coloured hair, which is odd enough in a part of the world where all populations present black hair. One of the most widely cited versions of the story comes from Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, daughter of Chief Winnemucca, and one of the first Native American women to publish a book in English. In Life Among the Paiutes, 1883, she recounts how the si-te-cah were enemies of her people. They were described to her, she wrote, as very tall with red hair, and remembered not just for violence, but for cannibalism. According to the version she learned from her grandfather, the Paiute and other allied tribes eventually trapped the last of the si-te-cah inside a cave. They stacked brush at the entrance and set it on fire. When smoke poured in and some of the cave dwellers tried to escape, they were killed with arrows. The rest died inside. The event wasn't described as myth, but as history. The cave, according to some elders, was the very same cave that would later be called Lovelock. And Winnemucca isn't alone. Over the years, anthropologists and linguists recorded similar versions of the story across western Nevada and the eastern Sierra. The si-te-cah, while not universally remembered by name, often appeared in tribal oral traditions as violent outsiders, raft dwellers, or long-forgotten enemies driven into hiding. Some debate exists over the exact translation of si-te-cah. It's often rendered as tool eaters, referencing the fibrous marsh plant used in both paiute and si-te-cah technologies. Others suggest it may imply raft people or even enemies across the water, all of which would align with their alleged mobility and aquatic tactics. The si-te-cah were never described as spirits or monsters. They were remembered as people. Different, yes. Dangerous, yes. But physical. Here's where the overlap becomes impossible to ignore. At Lovelock Cave, archaeologists later found duck decoys made of tulle, rope, sandals, nets, and woven tools that closely matched what both the paiute and the si-te-cah were said to use. Even the timeline occupation, beginning over 4,000 years ago, aligned broadly with the deep past described in oral tradition. But when scientific reports were published in the early 20th century, the story of the si-te-cah was largely left out. The red hair was noted and then rationalized. Large bones were measured, then explained away. And the indigenous memory was discarded as folklore. The assumption was clear. Science told the truth. Stories did not. But maybe that was the mistake, because over 100 years later, we still don't fully understand who was buried in Lovelock Cave. And the only people who ever claimed to know, they were never taken seriously. When the University of California arrived at Lovelock Cave in 1912, they weren't entering a blank slate. They were stepping into a site already disturbed, first by time, then by mining. The time the researchers showed up, over 6 tons of bat droppings had already been removed from the cave. Still, enough remained to warrant attention. Over the course of 2 formal excavations, first in 1912 and again in 1924, archaeologists catalogued over 10,000 objects. There were the expected finds: baskets, fishing tools, gaming pieces, twine and textiles. But there were stranger items: intricately crafted duck decoys made of tulle reeds, now recognized as some of the oldest in North America. Enormous reed sandals. Oh, and human remains, fragmented but unmistakable. Some of these remains showed signs of partial mummification, preserved by the dry, mineral-rich air of the cave. At least one had hair that was described in the field notes as reddish or auburn. Others had unusually large skulls, though most were within normal variation. The archaeological reports acknowledged some of these anomalies, but they didn't linger on them. No full skeletons of giants were documented in the official papers. No intact bodies measuring 7 feet or more. And while early photographs and local accounts described seeing tall, mummified bodies, these specimens allegedly quietly disappeared from public view in the decades that followed. Many of the bones were sent to museums and institutions, including the Nevada Historical Society and the Smithsonian. Today, they are either in storage, in limbo, or, according to some researchers, missing altogether. Requests to re-examine the remains have often been denied. Some were returned to native communities under repatriation laws like NAGPRA. Others were too poorly documented to trace, and some may have been lost entirely during museum renovations, collection consolidations, or mislabeling. This is what makes Lovelock Cave so frustrating. It isn't that someone's hiding a secret, it's that no one really knows what was lost. Between the destruction caused by guano mining, the lack of early documentation, and the patchy follow-up research, a significant portion of the site's original contents are unaccounted for. We know the cave was used for thousands of years. We know it was a place of storage, burial, and habitation. We know people left offerings here, rituals, tools, and memories. But beyond that, the story starts to blur. Were any of the remains truly unusual? Were the stories of giants the product of folklore or of misunderstood archaeology? Why did so many artifacts quietly vanish from the record? The cave didn't give us the answers. It gave us fragments, contradictions, and above all, questions. At first, the scientific community took Lovelock Cave seriously. After all, it was one of the richest prehistoric sites ever found in the Great Basin. The University of California's archaeological team, led by Llewellyn Loud and later by Mark Harrington, published detailed field reports. They documented artifacts across multiple stratified layers, stretching back over 4,000 years. But even in those early reports, something was missing. Not in the data, but in the tone. The findings were methodical, technical, careful, maybe too careful. The strange details, the red hair, the unusually long femurs, the 15-inch sandals were mentioned but never explored. Do you know what shoe size a 15-inch sandal actually makes? It's a size 23. That's insanely big shoes. Who would need sandals this big? And despite these weird elements, there was no follow-up, no deeper investigation into why some of the remains didn't quite match expectations. That caution would become silence. In the decades that followed, Lovelock Cave slipped from scientific conversation. It was characterized as solved. Its materials boxed away in museum archives, its anomalies either rationalized or ignored. One of the most glaring examples was the red hair. Multiple field notes and early eyewitnesses described human remains with reddish or auburn hair, unusual for native populations in the region. The standard explanation quickly emerged. The hair, originally black, had turned red due to chemical processes in the cave's alkaline soil. That's plausible. Alkali can bleach melanin, and mummification can alter pigmentation. But that's not proof. No genetic testing was done later to confirm hair color. No chemical analysis published. It was simply declared explained. The same happened with the oversized bones. Rather than examining the few unusually large remains in more detail, they were classified as within normal range. No forensic deep dives, no attempt to test claims that any skeletons exceeded 6 feet in height. In fact, the most detailed bones, the ones reportedly shown in early museum displays, vanished altogether. Even more troubling is the inconsistency in access. Independent researchers and native historians who've requested to re-examine the remaining artifacts or remains have frequently hit walls, denials, delays, and vague explanations. Institutions cite preservation concerns, lack of provenance, or legal limitations under NAGPRA, which governs the return of indigenous remains to descendant communities. But in the case of Lovelock Cave, those lines are blurry. The si-te-cah, if they existed, were not confirmed members of any known tribal group still alive today, and many of the artifacts and human remains removed before NAGPRA's passage were never properly catalogued or attributed. There's no certainty, only confusion. And that's where science faltered. by quietly backing away when the story got too strange. The red hair became a footnote, the oversized sandals a curiosity. The claims of missing bones turned into an internet rumor, and the oral histories, they were never revisited, never cross-examined, never considered as data. Lovelock Cave didn't fail science. Science chose to look the other way. Strip away the myths, remove the rumours, forget the vanished mummies, the giant legends, the red-haired ghosts. What actually remains? More than most people realise. As mentioned earlier in this video, Lovelock Cave is one of the most significant archaeological sites in the western United States. The stratified deposits, some reaching over 10 feet deep, contain a cultural record that spans thousands of years, from as early as 2000 BCE up to the arrival of European settlers. And the artifacts pulled from its dooky floor tell a story not of giants, but of ingenuity. The people who used this cave were skilled. They made tightly coiled baskets that held water. They twisted plant fibers into fishing lines and nets. They created lifelike models of ducks, used in marshland hunting thousands of years before modern waterfowl gear was imagined. Some of these decoys are now in the Smithsonian. Others sit quietly in Nevada collections. They also wore shoes, big ones. The 15-inch sandals are real, they're preserved, and they're among the largest ever found in North American prehistory. Could they have been made for unusually large individuals? Possibly. Or they could have been outer footwear, designed to fit over padding or other materials. We don't know. No matching skeleton has ever been definitively tied to them. As for the human remains found, they are harder to summarize. Many were fragmentary. A few were partially mummified. The vast majority were disturbed by miners, by time, by rodents, and by the unforgiving dig methods of the early 20th century. Some skulls appear to show unusual proportions, but no published analysis has confirmed anything beyond the normal range of human variation. We know that much of what was found is now unaccounted for. The University of California, Nevada State Museum, and Smithsonian have all held material from the site, but none claim to possess the tall skeletons or complete mummies once described by earlier visitors. And that's the reality. Lovelock Cave was an incredibly rich site, but it was probably discovered by the wrong guys at the wrong time. It was mined for guano before it was protected for science. Its deepest layers were destroyed before archaeologists could reach them, and the specimens that survived were handled with a mix of excitement, confusion, and eventually discomfort. We have to remember this was 1911 when it was first discovered. Scars from the Civil War were still very vivid. Some living people were still slaves not so long ago. The Indian reservations just stripped most natives of their lands, and any proof that would back the ancestral narrative in those troubled times, so close to World War I, were most probably not welcome anyway. Today, all that remains is a partial archive, some baskets, some bones, some legends, and the absence of certainty. As much as we know about what was found in Lovelock Cave, there's even more we can't confirm anymore. The evidence has just vanished. In the years following the initial excavation, both local residents and early visitors to nearby museums reported seeing something that never made it into the permanent collections. The mummified human remains, tall, dried, and still bearing reddish hair. Some of these were allegedly displayed in cases at the Nevada Historical Society and later at a small museum in Winnemucca. Newspaper clippings from the early 20th century referenced the discovery of giant skeletons in the cave. Descriptions varied. Some claimed 7 feet in length, others referenced sloping foreheads or massive jaws. One article mentioned the bones being sent to the Smithsonian. When researchers and independent investigators later contacted the Smithsonian for details, the response was always the same. No such specimens were ever received. No red-haired mummies, no oversized skeletons, nothing matching the description of the so-called giants of Lovelock. And when it comes to what was never officially documented, there's even less hope. Take the case of the 14-inch skull reportedly displayed in the early 1900s. Multiple visitors claimed to have seen it, but there's no official inventory number, no surviving photo, and no clear chain of custody. It's just gone. Today, institutions often cite NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, as the reason for the disappearance of certain remains. And in many cases, rightfully so. Repatriation has corrected centuries of extractive colonial science. Remains once studied without consent have been returned to their descendant communities. But in the case of Lovelock, the issue isn't just about legal protection, it's about documentation. Some of the remains in question were never formally recorded. Some were removed by miners before archaeologists ever arrived. Others were damaged beyond preservation. And some, if early reports are to be believed, were simply too strange to make it into the record. What's left today are conflicting testimonies, missing artifacts, and a paper trail that stops just short of resolution. Were red-haired mummies really found? Yes, at least according to field notes and eyewitnesses. Do we have them today? No. Were oversized skeletons documented in scientific literature? Not formally, but multiple credible accounts from the time mention them. So, what do we do with that? This isn't a story of suppressed truth. It's a story of lost evidence, of poor documentation, of fragile remains caught between guana miners, curious visitors, and an archaeology field still in its adolescence. And that's the real mystery of Lovelock Cave. Not whether something extraordinary was found, but we no longer have what we need to know for sure. It would be easy to draw a line between the Paiute stories and the artifacts in the cave, to point to the red hair, the sandals, the mummified remains, and say, case closed. The si-te-cah were real, but responsible storytelling and responsible science requires more. The truth is, oral history and archaeology don't always align neatly. That doesn't mean one is wrong. It means both are incomplete. The Paiute remember the si-te-cah as enemies, red-haired, violent, cannibalistic. The archaeological record reveals a long history of habitation in the cave. Thousands of years of tools, storage and burials. But it doesn't confirm violence. It doesn't show cannibalism. And it doesn't provide a clear, continuous identity for those who used the cave. It's entirely possible that the people buried in Lovelock were ancestral Paiute. It's also possible that they were part of a non-extinct group or one absorbed into surrounding cultures long ago. Maybe even a group killed as the stories are reporting it. Archaeology rarely gives us perfect answers, just fragments. And in this case, the fragments run out before the story does. The physical anomalies like oversized sandals or reddish hair could have rational explanations. Alkali soils do change hair color. Sandals may have been layered over padding, and skull shapes, while unusual, fall within the broader range of human variation. But possible explanations don't necessarily make an answer, because there's also the possibility that what we found in Lovelock Cave was something we weren't prepared to explain. Not giants, not myths made flesh, but maybe an isolated population with its own strange physical features. A unique culture, a group remembered for violence, not because they were monsters, but because they were different. And difference in the ancient world, as much as today, is dangerous. The Paiute stories might not describe literal cannibals. They might describe raiders, refugees, outsiders during a time of ecological stress or territorial conflict. The description of them as raft dwellers, people who lived on the water and travelling swiftly and attacking at night, could reflect a real tactical difference, later mythologized by those who fought them. Stories simplify. They flatten generations into villains and heroes. They are meant to be remembered, not carbon dated. And where science has gaps, memory persists. Lovelock Cave sits at the crossroads of both, a place where legend and evidence brush up against each other. Maybe the si-te-cah were real, maybe they weren't, but someone lived in that cave. Someone braided rope, made sandals, buried their dead, and left behind a silence we still don't know how to interpret. And whatever the truth was, it's buried in the same place we always leave our hardest stories, in the dust and guano. Lovelock Cave isn't just a mystery. It's a case study in how human history disappears. The most damaging loss is the one we chose. The decision not to revise all history. The unwillingness to test hair samples for pigmentation or DNA. The reluctance to admit that something truly unusual might have passed through our hands before we were ready to understand it. This isn't about proving the existence of giants. It's not about confirming every detail of their si-te-cah story. Had the Lovelock excavations happened today, we'd have 3D scans of the cave structure. We'd have full genetic profiles of the remains. We'd have isotope analysis, radiocarbon calibration, and the high-resolution imagery of every fibre, tool, and lock of hair. But back then, we didn't. And what we did have, we let scatter. The result is a haunting silence. A mystery locked not just in stone and guano, but in curatorial hesitation, incomplete records, and lost memory. And yet, even now, the story continues to echo, because the cave is still there. The oral traditions are still alive. The questions remain open. Maybe what was found in Lovelock was a window into a long-lost cultural conflict. Maybe it was a glimpse of something much older, more complex, and more human than we assumed. But we'll never know for sure. In 1911, 2 miners stepped into a cave looking for fertilizer and walked straight into a mystery. The truth is, something was found in Lovelock Cave. We may never know exactly what, but the echoes are still there. In the oral histories that refused to fade, in the artifacts that never made it home, in the cave that still watches over a dry lake bed in Nevada, holding on to secrets we once held in our hands and let slip away. If this story made you pause, if it made you wonder what else we've buried before we understood its value, give the video a like. Subscribe for more grounded stories from the edge of history and memory. and drop a comment. What do you think was really found in Lovelock Cave? Do you think the giants were a real thing? Your curiosity keeps these stories alive. Your questions carry the echo further. Until next time, keep listening to the echoes.